Hey, come over here. I have something to show you. Cadmium red. That opaque color, 10,000 miles wide. The color of Coca-Cola signs and chokeberries. Of tomatoes blushing as you walk by. And soccer shirts against a clean September sky. I think of Titian's Christ from 1534. Or Elizabeth Murray, who we lost way too soon. In this painting of mine, I'm using green like stripes on a race car to rip the eye through clotted fistfuls of red pigment. However, no discussion of red is complete without looking at Henri Matisse's Red Studio from 1911, which was actually blue underneath. Just like your studio and mine, a painter's workspace is a self-portrait. Although Matisse the man is nowhere to be seen, we see actual paintings of his hanging on the walls, lit not by windows or bulbs, but by pure saturated color. Look closely at the white lines which define the forms. Matisse didn't paint white over red, but applied skins of red everywhere except the lines. This technique is called reserve line. I always vomit a little in my mouth when people say it doesn't look realistic. Matisse is a maker, not a matcher. This painting is radical because the artist is violently ripping himself away from the European tradition of linear and atmospheric perspective in favor of the flat picture plane. Rather than looking into pictorial illusion, we look at a flat surface smeared with skins of color. Matisse is telling us that there is no such thing as creativity, only decisions. He's saying, let's play. This painting of mine, called Grapeland, was informed by the landscape paintings of the American Impressionist, Frank Dumond, 1865 to 1951, whose teaching career at New York's Art Students League spanned 5 decades and claimed such notable pupils as Norman Rockwell, Georgia O'Keeffe, and John Marin. Dumond developed the prismatic palette, still in use by plein air painters today. Less a formula than a way of thinking, the prismatic palette lays out strings of colors according to values, from lightest to darkest. The first string is comprised of out-of-the-tube colors, in order from left to right: white, yellow, orange, red, blue, and black. The second string is a progression of pre-mixed grays arranged in descending values, from lightest to darkest. The third string is green, and the fourth blue, from lightest to darkest. With this palette, Dumond armed plein air painters with the tonal range to capture the fleeting light of any season or weather. Since I don't paint outdoors, I've modified the prismatic palette over the years to suit my own needs. However, I always keep a string of grays on my palette for Frank. I make big paintings of small things, of alder and willow, of iris and hot drops of rain. I've seen 52 summers, each one more radiant than the last. Every painting I make is like a Rolodex, spinning through every season I've ever witnessed. The longer I live, the fatter my Rolodex. This is why all of my landscape paintings refer to standing in one season, peering ahead into another, longing for October in May. The Western eye is trained to read from left to right. Therefore, I compose with this lateral span in mind. Just like my tree studies, my landscape paintings don't rely on linear perspective to establish pictorial depth. but are more akin to Egyptian friezes, in which a wide entablature is decorated with reliefs, rhythmically arranged across a shallow space. However, rather than a panoramic view from a static vantage point, I want your gaze to travel across the terrain like a tracking shot in a film, as if you're actually wandering in the woods, not talking, just walking. The one constant that brings everything together is rhythm. I played drums professionally for 20 years, and I know how to manipulate awareness using repetition and contrast. Just as a comic structures a joke in threes, 2 to establish a pattern, and 1 to break it. Artists are different. Not only do we take the road less traveled, we go to the end of the road. A great idea is worthless unless it's been wrung out, examined, and re-examined from every possible angle. Perhaps this is why so many great schools of painting developed literally at the end of the road. For example, there used to be a sign at the branch of routes 6 and 6A in Provincetown that read, "Provincetown, either way." From Charles Hawthorne to Blanche Lazelle and Hans Hofmann, that small community enjoys a rich and storied painting history that continues today, partly because of its remoteness. Likewise, William Merritt Chase's Shinnecock Hills Summer School of Art, founded in 1891, brought painters by train to the end of the line, into the glorious light of the eastern tip of Long Island. The list goes on. The group of 7 followed Yonge Street due north into the Canadian wilderness. The Newlyn School painted at the edges of the rugged Cornish coast of England, and plein air painters flocked to the tip of Key West for the light. When there's nowhere left to go, you can go anywhere. Art thrives on its limitations. When teachers would say that art is whatever I wanted it to be, I felt bummed for days. That's how you speak to a child. Freedom isn't doing anything you want, but everything you can within walls. On my studio wall is a 1964 photograph of the poet Mary Oliver, taken by her beloved partner Molly Malone Cook, called My First Clam. I adore it precisely because I remember my first clam in the marshes of South Carolina. Isn't that the purpose of art? To make us say, I was there too. A postcard of Johann Tischbein's 1787 drawing Goethe at the window of his Roman apartment also hangs on my studio wall for precisely the same reason. Because I, too, stood at the window of my pension overlooking Piazza Navona when I was a 22-year-old, alone in the Eternal City. I studied the image carefully and recreated it down to the last detail, even kicking off my right flip-flop. This wasn't about honoring Tischbein, but creating a layer of protection around myself. Every artist must manufacture this protective layer. Try it. Look at a person in any painting and do as they do. For ultimately, you aren't mimicking one person, but all people who seek a better version of themselves. Drawing is my protection. I don't draw to make things appear, but disappear. Each carefully rendered mark nudges me farther from visible reality into a crafted one, leaving me both depleted and supplied. Here's a little 8 by 6 inch pencil drawing of my hero, the late Canadian pianist Glenn Gould, who lived from 1932 to 1982. I made this sitting at my tiki bar one late afternoon. As with every drawing and painting, it is really a self-portrait masquerading as someone or something else. I begin with large open gestures, a series of overlapping ovals. This is when you capture the attitude of the subject. If you get it wrong here, you're fucked. Next come light areas of shading to suggest volume. Don't worry about eyes until you locate their sockets. Same for the nose, which is just a smudge at this point. 3 small ovals will later become the mouth. The left contour of the face was critical here. Gould had a jagged, axe-like face. I wanted a clean, animated line that was also musical in its utterance. I've started on the eye features here, the brows and lashes. The nose is too long at this point, but I'll fix that later. First, time for a break. Ah, that was delicious. I was grossly overserved. Okay. Gould had small ears that stuck out like side view mirrors. He had perfect pitch and photographic memory. I paid extra attention to the ears because of the 5 senses, hearing is primary to a musician. Picasso, in Blind Man's Meal, rendered the ear, nose, and fingers with tender care to bring our attention to the other senses, heightened in blindness. I've adjusted the nose and continue using values to suggest mass. I've also added the large shapes of the hand and Gould's telltale mole over his lip. Next comes his unruly hair. I spent decades going through every bit of this man's life in the National Library of Canada. I've read his love letters and held his shoes. Yep, I was stalking a dead guy. And here's the final drawing.
I moved to New York City from South Carolina on May 12, 1987, the day after my graduation from the College of Charleston. And upon my arrival in Manhattan, I had 2 simple goals: to sit on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and eat an authentic New York hot dog, and then call the comedian Henny Youngman on the phone. I had read that his number was unlisted. So I took the 6 train to 86th and Lex, and walked a couple of blocks where I found a bevy of hot dog carts at the base of the museum steps. After finishing my dog, you know the type, mopped in red onion and mustard, I stood up, wiped my hands and my jeans, and inserted a greasy quarter into a payphone and called the king of the one-liners. He answered, "Yes, I'll do it." I love so much about this, I don't know where to start. Here was a legendary entertainer who was totally accessible. I've never understood people who get into show business in order to get out of it. They whine about being recognized and lament being approached by people in the street with questions. Henny Youngman was a Borscht Belt staple, famous for playing the violin and telling jokes like, "When I read about the evils of drinking, I quit reading." Our conversation began with my telling him that we were both big dudes, over 6'2". I told him that I had just moved to New York from South Carolina to begin my life as an artist, and I asked what advice he had for a 21-year-old numbnuts. He said, "Say yes to everything. You never know when it will lead to work." Here was a man who, when his agent moved in across the street from his apartment, hung a banner out of his window that read, "Hire thy neighbor." Then we talked about turkey sandwiches, as his apartment was across the street from Carnegie Deli. Our conversation was brief, psychedelic, and it changed my life. When I was starting out, I used to think that just because an artist had work hanging in a gallery or museum, they must be good. It ain't true. They're lucky. If that same artist still has work hanging in 25 years, then he or she is good. Time determines quality, not the market. The man I called on the payphone way back in 1987 was an elderly, out-of-fashion comedian sitting in his apartment doing shtickala without an audience. He was doing it for himself. Do the work, regardless of whether or not people are looking. A young Willie Nelson said from backstage, "Looks like a full house, even though a lot of them are dressed as empty seats." No matter, a pro does the exact same show for one person as for 1,000 people. I have a career because I had great teachers. Artists like Michael Tyzak, Gregory Amanoff, John Raimondi, Tony Fitzpatrick, Judy Pfaff, and Ursula von Reitingsward. They taught me that art thrives on generosity, and I honor their example by being accessible to anyone who's interested. And I've welcomed hundreds of classes and art groups to my studio since the late 80s. I answer every single email myself, and I keep making these YouTube videos because you keep taking the time to watch them. I couldn't do it without you, and I appreciate it. It doesn't take much to help a fellow artist. Reach out to one and remind them that they are not alone. Say to them, "Isn't this divine, this thing we do?" Every May 12th, for the last 31 years, I sit on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art with a hot dog in one hand and a picture of Henny Youngman in the other. And I thank my lucky stars that I live in a city that doesn't care what I do, because there's always someone doing it better. And then I say out loud, yes, I'll do it.